Pineda, and today I will be discussing the book Why Does Evil Exist by Professor Charles Mathewes. So this book is part of the Great Courses. I listened to it on Audible. I believe you can get it in paper copy as well. It was published in 2013 or recorded in 2013, and it is such an interesting book, like one of the most interesting books I've ever listened to. And just the topic itself, why does evil exist? Whether it's, philosophical or theological question, it's just such an interesting question. Like, why does it exist? And so what he basically does is he goes through the history of any sort of writing on this topic. And he begins like back with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is like 1200 BC, and then to the present day. And it's interesting to hear all the different authors and theologians and historians and just how people discuss this issue, the topic of evil. So before I get too much into it, if there's anything today that you hear that you like or find interesting, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. All right, I will begin. So as mentioned, Professor Mathewes starts with the Epic of Gilgamesh. So this is the first recorded human attempt, he says, to explain a world where suffering happens, where evil happens, where evil occurs. And this text is in Akkadian, and this is from 1200 BC. And so he kind of talks about just like it's a story, and he discusses this story and how like the topic of evil is even understood at this time. And so he says Gilgamesh, who's half man and half god, is a hard and like strong king. And to stop him from being so oppressive, the gods create Unkito, his friend and equal, part animal and part human. And the gods actually end up killing his friend. So Gilgamesh was terrified by death at this point and went on a search for immortality. And this is what is said to Gilgamesh when he's dying. So he ends up, dying at the end. And so he's told, death is part of being human. We can choose how to live in spite of death. We are the only species that know we are going to die one day. So it was very interesting, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And if you haven't read it, it's a really interesting read. And there are actually fragments of it from Samaria dating back to 2000 BC. So it's incredible, the history there. Professor Mathewes talks about tragedies, myths. He looks at Thucydides and his writing on the Peloponnesian War, Greek philosophy, Greek tragedies, and he discusses like specific examples from each of these periods of history, and one being Oedipus and his mother Jocasta. So this is a well-known story, but I didn't know it in detail. Like all I knew is that Oedipus ended up like making love to his mother. Anyway, so the actual story, if you're not familiar, is Oedipus Rex is a figure of Greek mythology from at least 5th century BC. So a Greek playwright, Sophocles, first introduced us to this character in his trilogy series known as the Theban plays, which explore themes of fate, truth, and guilt. So Oedipus's father, Laius, and then Jocasta, his mom, were told by an oracle if they ever conceived a son, he would kill his father, he would kill Laius. So when she bore a son, Laius ordered her to kill him, and she couldn't, but told a servant to. And then he couldn't either, so he left the infant outside in the forest. A shepherd found the baby and offered it to the king and queen of Corinth, who couldn't conceive. So then, when Oedipus grew up, he actually did end up killing his father in a battle. And he didn't know the connection. Neither of them knew the connection at the time, because the king Laius thought that his son had been killed, and Oedipus had no idea that that was his father. So he ended up marrying Jocasta, since, he had killed the king, he married the queen, and they had 4 children. And so when the truth was revealed, she killed herself, and he blinded himself by stabbing himself in the eyes with like her hairpin, I think it was, and he asked to be exiled. So, yeah, it's quite the story. And Professor Mathewes, also talks about in the history of Western literature, there are only two characters, he says, where in everything we have written about them, they have already experienced their own death. So I don't know if you want to take a guess, but the authors writing about these two figures already know the fate. These figures already know the fate of their own death. So everything written about Socrates is one, and Jesus is the other, are all written in the shadow of what is ultimately their own fate, which is interesting. So only two figures, two characters in Western literature. Not that he's equating them, but he's saying there are just two, where writings about them, it's like already known. These figures already knew what was going to happen to them. So there's no easy way, Professor Mathewes says, to learn about reality except through suffering it. That is what is kind of gleaned from a lot of these writings that he examines. Can you gain knowledge theoretically about suffering and evil, or do you have to experience it? That's a question that he poses. And the whole idea behind, the fruit or the tree of knowledge in Adam and Eve, like it's the idea of having to experience it. You can't sit back and read about what suffering is. You're not gonna really understand quite how it feels unless you've gone through it and then come out on the other end of it. So he says also that Adam and Eve were not wrong in thinking they could be like God. He says they were wrong in thinking they could be like God by eating material things, which is interesting. Professor Mathewes says that evil can be divided into two types. Moral evil, that's a type of evil that's caused by intentional human will, so by humans, and natural evil caused by nature, so tsunamis, hurricanes, things of that nature. Professor Mathewes discusses St. Augustine. St. Augustine was born in 354 AD in North Africa. He is one of the greatest philosophical thinkers in the West on evil, actually, and he taught rhetoric in Rome and Milan in his youth, basically. I think he was like 20. He found this life unsatisfactory and felt drawn to Christianity. So his mother was a Christian, and I think his father wasn't, and so he was drawn to his mother's religion. And he converted at the age of 32, and went back to Africa, started a monastery and sort of like a think tank where he wanted to just live a celibate life with his friends, and he just wanted to kind of talk about God, and so he actually became the Bishop of Hippo and was in that position for almost 40 years. St. Augustine talks about the fall, and the fall as being like a mystery, and how punishment is universal but obscurely distributed. God's justice and mercy, he says, will be revealed in salvation, but until then, the obscurity of the suffering we experience in this life and the merit we have deserved this suffering, that is completely obscure. So, so it's interesting. St. Augustine also wrote The City of God. I'm currently reading that. That's a long one, so I'll be reviewing that soon-ish, I hope. I'm skipping some of the people that Professor Mathewes touches on just because there's a lot there. It's like a very long book, a long course. And so it's so interesting, though. So if you want to hear all of it or read all of it, then I encourage you to do so. But I'm just talking about specific people. So I'm going to talk about Luther next, Martin Luther. Professor Mathewes talks about him and the idea behind good works. And he says the devil loves this idea of good works because it means you have a hand in your own salvation. You can play God, essentially. But it's never been said so clearly before, to me anyway. It really hit home, like the idea why many Protestants don't like the idea of good works. And the idea of good works means that you have, or the idea is that you have a hand in your own salvation, you can play God. And that is not the way Catholics look at it at all. But it's interesting. That is how Luther looked at it. He talks about Machiavelli. Machiavelli basically, so the idea there is that leaders of a state have to do evil acts sometimes, but he wanted to teach them how to not let those acts consume them. And so he was talking to the prince being a Medici in Florence, and Machiavelli wanted to instruct him on being successful as a leader. So he's saying they have to do these acts for the good of the state, but they can't let these bad acts sometimes consume them and their soul and corrupt them. Machiavelli basically wanted to teach the idea of like how to be evil in a cold-blooded way so that evil doesn't corrupt you, as bad as that sounds. And the importance of knowing what's requested of a leader. Like that is what he wanted to convey. Be cold-hearted, but protect yourself from it consuming you. Professor Mathewes talks about the Enlightenment, talks about Bayle and Alexander Pope and different debates that were had surrounding evil. And the idea at this time, the debates were basically about like a world where freedom and evil exist, and whether this is better than a world where neither existed. He talks about Karl Marx. Marx basically believed that evil existed due to social conditions and material inequalities. Professor Mathewes ends his different lectures with Albert Camus. He was a French philosopher and author, renowned. He wrote after the Second World War, and he's the author of The Plague. If you haven't read it, it's phenomenal, published in 1947. And he basically said that evil is real. It will confront us after everything you saw in the Second World War. We have to decide how to respond to it. So don't be victims or executioners. This is what he says. Don't be victims or executioners. He's speaking directly about what happened to the Jews and the Holocaust in the Second World War. And he also says that joy is not permanent. So it's something that has to be appreciated and searched for, basically. It's not a permanent thing. Evil will constantly confront you. It is real, and you just have to choose how you respond to it. So I'm going to leave it there. There is so much in this book. I highly recommend it. If there's anything today that you've heard that you found interesting or liked, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And until next time, thanks for listening.